Hello and welcome to the Shanty Show, the show about shanties. Today we are very honored and happy to be joined by the incredible Heather Wood of the Young Tradition.
Yeah, we first met Heather back in 2015, 2016 at the Mystic Sea Music Festival in Mystic, Connecticut, and had the great good pleasure of singing a few songs in a parking lot with her and then getting up on stage and trying them out there. She's got some incredible stories. This is a really great episode. You're going to love it.
To me away.
A small seed from a fir tree fell to a far-off forest floor. It grew and grew as fir trees do, and then it grew some more. It dreamed that it would become the mast of a tall ship, wild and free, bearing the sails before the gales as it sailed the open sea. And then one day the logger came and the fir tree hit the ground. First I'll be prepped, then I'll be stepped, and then I'm outward bound. But alas, such dreams are rarely true. Just look to what it's come. Its final lot was to stand in a pot with its head up an angel's bum.
Great stuff. Well, that's an interesting variation on Old Maui, it sounds like.
Right. Yeah, that's the tune.
Can you tell us a bit about that version?
I wrote it. It seemed... I do write songs, but I don't usually sit down and say, gosh, I'm going to write a song today. They happen to me usually while I'm waiting for buses. And then they demand to get written, and sometimes I remember them.
And do you often write songs to tunes of shanties or traditional songs that you know?
No, usually the tune comes along with the song, and I make up the tune, but that particular one just happened to fit Maui, so that's where that was.
That's interesting. I find I have trouble with writing lyrics myself, but when I have been successful, it seems to come from somewhere mysterious and it's kind of coming through me, and I have to write it down as quick as I can, otherwise it's gone.
That's the one, yeah. That's the way it happens. Yeah.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here with us today, Heather.
Well, it's good to be with you.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's so many things I would like to talk about and sort of ask about, but I guess can we start at your musical beginnings? Of course, you were 1/3 of the Young Tradition, which was just an incredible folk group out of England in the 60s. Can you tell us, how did you get into music in general? How did you start singing with the other two gentlemen?
Okay, well, I've sung all my life. I was in school choirs, and in English schools in my day, we had folk music. We had a little Bakelite radio, about this big, and we had Singing Together with William Appleby.
Hello, schools. We'll begin the new term with Brennan on the Moor. Well, now, Mr. Bevan's going to sing you the first verse, and the boys are going to come in the chorus, so if you follow carefully, you'll be all right. Right, Mr. Bevan?
It's of a fierce highwayman, this story I will tell.
And we'd all cluster around this radio, and the teacher would have the big book with the accompaniment, and she would play the piano, and we would have the book of words, and they were, heavily laundered for small children. But we had the bedrock of that, which was mostly folk music. And then every morning in school you'd go in and there was assembly, and you'd have 2 hymns, a reading from the Bible, the Lord's Prayer, the 2 Jews and 3 Catholics would come in, business of the school, go to class. And given that the Church of England knocked off its words and its music from everywhere, you also had that bedrock of music, a lot of which is folk music. When you look in the list of titles, it says, Welsh folk music, Scottish folk song, so on and so forth. So then I left school, went to university, dropped out of university, joined the army as an officer cadet, because that's what my mother wanted me to do. realised I'd make a perfect army officer because I am by nature an arrogant and bossy cow, and decided to leave. And what was interesting was there were 9 of us in our cadet intake wing, and we were playing with a Ouija board, and we asked it which of us will not be commissioned, and it said I would not. And so we said, what should you do? And it said leave army and sing. So I thought, okay, wasn't planning on that, but I went to London and was hanging out and going to various folk clubs, and walked one day into the Scots House in Cambridge Circus, and there were Pete and Royston, who were singing Copper Family Harmonies, and started joining in from the floor, and then we ended up sort of hanging out and singing together, and then people started saying, can we book you, we'll pay you, and we thought, golly gosh, well, yeah, why not? So that was how the YT started, and that I was the bit of the audience that wouldn't go away. And
what year might that have been?
1965. First came to America in 67.
Good.
So we sang around England, for a while, and made a couple of albums. The first recording contract we were offered by Transatlantic, they would give us 9 hours of recording studio time. They would pay us $27, and they would own everything. And we said, no, thank you very much, no. We waited 6 months until we had more of a reputation and a following, and then we got a reasonably civilized contract, and we recorded with Transatlantic thereafter.
And were those recordings done in England or in America?
In England, all of them. The first recording session was in Pi Records' 16-track rock and roll studio. We were moving in just as Stevie Winwood, who was about 15 at the time, was moving out. And so we're in this really high-tech studio that was totally dead, and we couldn't hear each other. And I had hysterics and burst into tears, and luckily, Louisa Jo Killen was there and held my hand all through the first session. But then they found us a restored church to sing in, and that was much better because it had ambience and we could hear each other. So,
of course. Now, is that the record that has Chicken on a Raft in it and All on the Bowlin'?
No. That was the first record, which was called The Young Tradition. And then there was the second record, which was called So Cheerfully Round. And then Transatlantic wanted another record, but we didn't have time. We were doing too much work. So we said, well, we can throw you a shanty EP. So that's how the Chicken on a Raft EP came out, which I wanted to call Just Add Water, but the lads wouldn't let me.
The skipper's in the wardroom drinking gin. Aye-o, chicken on a raft. I don't mind a knocking, but I ain't a going in. Aye-o, chicken on a raft. The Jim is a laughing like a rain. Aye-o, chicken on a raft. Be looking in me comic cuts again. Aye-o, chicken on a raft. And a chicken on a raft on a Monday morning. Oh, what a terrible sight to see. That toes forward and the dustman aft. Sitting there picking at a chicken on a raft.
They were mean.
Now, for folks who are listening who may not know the Young Tradition or have only sort of heard you lately, like I remember you're probably one of the very early harmony bands that I heard. And if I'm recalling this correctly, like the whole perspective behind it was that vocal harmony music can go toe-to-toe with any other popular music at its time, and like that stance and that power behind how you sang really stood out to me. It still does. I'd love to hear a little bit from you about, what you and Peter Bellamy and Royston Wood were like. What were you going for when you were singing these things? Was there an attitude behind it?
Peter always wanted to be a traditional folk singer if he couldn't be a blues singer. Royston came out really preferring classical music, but liking folk music, and I liked rock and roll. So, and we listened to everything. I mean, we lived in the same house in North London for a long time, And we had a fairly extensive record collection. We were listening to American music, Eastern European music, Indian rags, anything we could get our muddy little paws on, we would listen to. And somehow it all came together in the music, because if you listen to what we're doing, some of it's harmony, some of it's counterpoint, some of it's just plain weird. But our method of rehearsal, this was in the days before we owned a tape recorder, because that would have cost money and we had none. Peter always sang melody, so Peter would learn the words and sing the melody, and we'd all sing the melody until we all knew the words and the melody. And then Peter would sing the melody and Royston would put in his bass harmony, however long that took. And then when they'd finished with that, I'd come in and play around the edges. And, we walked around the living room singing at each other, and eventually we'd all sort of be in the middle with our heads together, and that would be when we knew that that song was happening. Sometimes it didn't happen for months. I mean, Biker Hill, right, which was one of our pets.
When first I went down to the dirt, I had a no cowl nor no pitch shirt. Now I've gotten 2 or 3 Walker pits done well by me. Biker Hill and Walker Shore, Collier lads forevermore. Biker Hill and Walker Shore, Collier lads forevermore.
Couldn't get it together. Just wasn't happening until we sang in a club in Manchester. Do you know those old coal cellars where they had arches around with holes in from the street so that the coal would fall in and pile? Well, this club was in one of those cellars, and the singers were in one of the coal arches. And I forget which song we were singing, but it pitched somewhere that put me into a range I didn't know I had. And after that, Biker Hill sort of happened. We always started our gigs with Chicken on a Raft, because that was the one song that we could sing any type of venue we were in. If anyone's listening who sings unaccompanied, you'll know that the room makes a difference to where you pitch things. All those people stuck with instruments are stuck with instruments. The rest of us can enjoy ourselves. So that gave us a feel of the room and told us, whether we were singing high or low, or whether we should repitch things.
Now, I'm kind of curious about when the young tradition was initially sort of coming out onto this folk scene. As you mentioned, there was the kind of the seeds being planted, post-war on that radio show, which I know my father, growing up in England, has talked about, the Singing Together with William Appleby. And at the same time, it sort of occurs to me you would have had other groups sort of like Pentangle, maybe mixing in a bit of rock and roll instrumentation here and there. And at the same time, you've got A.L. Lloyd and Ewan MacColl taking a arguably more traditional kind of route. How did that all feel at the time?
When we started singing together in 1965, there was a folk club every night in London, maybe 2, and the occasional all-nighter. And this was actually before Pentangle. It's when Bert and John were singing somewhat and playing sometimes together. They lived upstairs from us. So, there was always music in our house. Ewan and Bert had the Singers Club, which we would go to any chance we got, and they had a number of great people. And a lot of the old traditional singers were still alive. We made the pilgrimage up to Norfolk to visit with Harry Cox, and we went to his local pub. His daughter didn't like him singing around the house because she preferred the Beatles, but we had a lovely evening at the pub. The way the young tradition got its name, there was a club called the Grand Tradition, which as its regulars was supposed to have Paddy Tunney, Joe Heaney, Packy Byrne, various people like that. They kept not showing up, but we kept showing up to hear them, and then we got sort of asked to sing. And so eventually they decided, well, if the grand tradition isn't happening, how about the young tradition? So that's, the club came first, and then we got the name, the singers from the young tradition, shortened to the young tradition.
Do you recall who gave you guys that name?
Sorry?
Do you recall who gave you guys that moniker, that name?
Oh, it was a Scotsman called Bruce Dunnett, who ran various clubs and managed various people, including us, until the time he double booked us with somebody, and we went a long way away and got there and discovered that we didn't have a gig. So we went back and said, you know, this really isn't working, goodbye. So that was that.
One of the reasons I was asking about what it sort of felt like being you guys on that folk scene in England at the time is my father has very fond recollections of witnessing the young tradition when he was in teachers college, and I just called him up before to double check I had the right information. So it was St. Mary's Teachers College, Strawberry Hill, Twickenham, and he said it just sort of blew his socks off, and he was so impressed by you guys. And he also has a memory of hearing A.L. Lloyd and feeling that the crowd at the time were almost sort of laughing at him and not really appreciating what they were witnessing at the time. And that seems odd to me, given that A.L. Lloyd is sort of one of the pillars of the shanty, from the historian kind of side of it and from the recorded side of things.
Yeah. Bert was a truly lovely person. He, when we first started, a lot of people in the folk Nazi group, you know, I mean, this is folk music, it's mine. You can look at it, but it's mine, and I'm right. A lot of people said, this is not traditional. And we said, sorry, you know, we've got a traditional song, traditional tune. We happen to be doing a different arrangement from probably what the old gentleman that it was recorded from did, but this is the folk process. And we were chatting to Bert, and he said, look, whatever you do with a song, just be sure that you're adding to it. And whatever you do is fine, providing that's the case. Thank you. You know, it was very sensible of him, because people went out and did a lot of really odd things with songs, but some of them were spectacular. Pentangle, Fairport and Steel Eye Span were all slightly later than us. The Watersons were slightly before us, and the Watersons were a family, so their voices blended much more than ours did. We had three very distinct voices. They had four family voices, as the Copper family did. And it's there's definitely a thing about singing in families where they just fit.
Going back to, you know, you sort of mentioned people's desire to say this is folk music and it's done this way and it's precious. We had the Johnson girls on the show, and one of the things that they told us was there was a period of time where if you were a woman, you could not lead a shanty. It was frowned upon. Was that your experience?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. 1965, girls just did not lead shanties. It wasn't expressed. It just didn't happen. You were graciously allowed to sing on the choruses. Yes.
When did that change for you?
It never did in the young tradition days. So years later, and I think it's groups like the Liverpool Judies from Philadelphia and the Johnson girls especially that have made it possible for girls to sing shanties. Because, you know, given all the handsome cabin boys, I'm sure there were some of them who sang.
So let's continue with your story then. So young tradition is well established at this point, and you know, performing in America, in the UK, I'm sure beyond there as well. Let's pick up there. How did things evolve from there?
Well, how we first came to America, we persuaded our record company to buy our air tickets. And so we're booked for the Newport Festival in '67. And I'm not sure, played 67 and 68, and I'm not sure which year it was, but they put us all up in the wonderful Newport mansions, right? So the one we were in had a great marble staircase with a space at the bottom, which wonderful acoustics for shanties. So we're just down there singing a shanty of some description, and I hear this great voice behind me. I turn round, it's Janis Joplin, who is joining in quite merrily. Okay, fine, Janis sings shanties.
Because that's the thing that some people might not realize, right? Who weren't around then or don't have connections. Like, there wasn't much of a distinction at that time between traditional folk music and what was popular music. It was all kind of...
Well, the Newport Folk Festival back then used to hire a lot of traditional musicians. I mean, I was lucky enough to see Reverend Gary Davis, John Hurt, various of the Black Blues guys. People like Norman Kennedy, who thank goodness is still with us. And I'd have to go look at the program to remember who was there, but we were lucky because the first year we were there was the first year Newport had decided not to amplify the workshop stages, and we'd never used microphones anyway, we were just generally loud. So our workshop stage was where people were coming off the main concert, and because they could actually hear us as opposed to the poor little Americans who were singing into their sound holes on the next stage, we got the biggest audience.
Sorry, is that because you had practice without mics? Is that what you mean by that?
It wasn't practice without mics, we just never had mics. Folk clubs in England didn't.
Mm-hmm.
So
to go back to your point about the Wattersons and people from a family having a group of timbres that work well together, I have to say one of the things I really love about the young tradition, you guys have a very bright, very forward sound to your singing, which I think works very well with how the three of you did sing together. Very sort of recognizable sound.
Well, that's Pete. I mean, there's no mistaking Pete's voice.
On the 21st of October, before the rising sun, we formed the line for action, me boys, at 12 o'clock begun. Brave Nelson to his men did say, the Lord will prosper us this day, give them the broadside fire away on board the man of war.
Royston was just a lovely velvety bass baritone, and I was the loose cannon in the middle.
Can you tell us a bit more about Pete Bellamy? I know he wrote the play that was it The Transport.
The Transport, yeah. Pete, fascinating guy, art school dropout, loved folk music. As I said, would have really liked to be Muddy Waters, but realised he couldn't be. Although he's most usually connected with Norfolk, he was actually born in Bournemouth. Don't tell anyone. And he was a total genius. He painted. He made up songs and tunes, and I mean his songwriting is incredibly good, and that's why a lot of his stuff is being sung out to this day. One of the good things about being in a group is you always know when you've done a good gig, no matter what the audience reaction is, and in many ways it's worse to do a lousy gig, know you've done a lousy gig, and be screamingly well received, than to do a good gig and have the audience just sit there. But when you're on your own, you don't have that point of being able to say, all right, the audience was from hunger, but we were okay. And I think that's one of the things that took out Pete when he was on his own. Plus he wasn't getting the bookings. So I think he figured I am what I sing. People don't want what I sing, therefore they don't want me, therefore I'll just, say goodnight. So he did, which was sad.
When did you start making music, and of course, well, what kind of music you started? Was it folk or was it something else?
It was sort of folk. It was basically American folk in my early teens. In the 1950s, then I heard the skiffle groups. People like Lonnie Donegan were making not very good English recordings of songs they'd learned from people like Leadbelly, the Deep South black singers. And that caught my imagination, and while a lot of people followed from that directly into rock and roll, I went into rock and roll too, listening-wise, but for performance I started looking for the roots of the skiffle stuff, which meant I was listening to the black singers like Big Bill Brunsey and Leadbelly and Sonny Terry and Brian McGee. Then I discovered American folk music, per se, as given to us by people like Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie. And then, when I was about 17 years old, I discovered that England had folk music too, and I could do it better.
And stupid. Don't commit suicide, it's bad for you. When we first got together, there were just the three of us, and we'd set up a tour that was maybe 4 or 5 gigs in a sort of geographic arc away from London. And we'd go there, and the guys would pick up a different girlfriend every night, and eventually we'd end up back in London. But then they both got prominent women, which meant instead of going out and driving around, we were going out and coming back, and it just got A, very tiring, and B, very expensive. And we weren't really making enough money to support 3 households. We did okay when the 3 of us were living together and sort of hanging out together. And Peter wanted to do more traditional stuff. Royston was getting more into medieval music. I was drifting as usual. And so we ended up breaking up. Still friends, and we got together a couple of times after that. But that was it as far as a career as the Young Tradition was concerned. Yeah.
Now, you just alluded a little bit to my next question, which is how or who would have selected which songs in the repertoire. And as you mentioned, Royston there, is it Agincourt Carol comes to mind. And then you guys also have the Lyke Wake Dirge, which is perhaps my favorite recording you guys did. So who would be finding these songs? And was there a sort of democratic process? Was it kind of haphazard?
Well, we all spent time in Cecil Sharp House Library. We all had songs from our background, of singing through our youths that we brought up. And we'd look around and listen around and see what was happening. And the democratic process was, if you found a song you liked, you would bring it and sing it at the other 2. And it would be a yes, no, maybe. And we'd do it that way, it really was democratic, because there are 3 of you, and when you have a majority, you can do that. So that's good. So, excuse me a moment, I need to shut a door.
What was the Lyke Wake Dirge we sang with Heather at Mystic? Right?
We did, yeah. I've got a recording somewhere.
Yeah, we didn't sing it great.
I've got a recording of us in the parking lot, which we could maybe...
Brilliant, we'll splice it into
Yeah.
Because the parking lot was great.
That was great.
Sorry, I'm back. Well, the Lyke Wake Dirge, the words go back a long way. I first heard the words the night before I took my Army Selection Board in Arnold Wesker's play Chips with Everything. It's in there. And we had this friend called Hans Fried, who ran Collett's Record Shop, which was a folk record shop in London. And he had heard this tune for the Lyke Wake Dirge. And the unfortunate thing is, Hans, who knew more about folk music than virtually anybody, couldn't sing. So, and was very shy. So he's behind the sofa in our living room singing the Lyke Wake Dirge for us, sort of crouched down on the floor. And we're taking it a line at the time saying, "Is this what you think you were singing?" And so eventually we got the tune as we recorded it. So, right.
So those harmonies, those are entirely of your own making then?
Oh, yeah.
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 And would you say that influenced the pentangle version once you heard the pentangle one?
Do you know I've never heard the pentangle version? As I said, Bert and John lived upstairs, but other than occasionally having to walk upstairs and put a cushion under Bert's foot when he was thumping the floor with it, and you know, we'd see them in various concerts and so on. We were friends, but as I said, pentangle was somewhat after the heyday of the YT, so I never really listened much to them.
So, but you kept singing, obviously, after the Young Tradition, and I think you performed with Royston for a while after that under the name No Relation.
Yes, given that people always thought that somehow we were either brother and sister or married, none of which was true, we thought No Relation was a good enough name. And we did an album under that name with Peter and various other people. And then I sang for a while with Andy Wallace, who's a fine singer and instrumentalist from the Washington area. And then with Tom Gibney and David Jones as Poor Old Horse. What happened was they booked us for the New York City Revels in, I think, 92. And we were singing Christmassy songs, and it was going very well. And so we're in the dressing room one day, and I said, "Do we want to take this group on the road?" And Tom Gibney looked up at me and said, "Aren't you a little dangerous to sing with?" Because by this time both my previous singing partners in the YT were dead. And I said, "Well, not in the short term." But then unfortunately Tom died of melanoma of some sort, which was unfortunate. So yes, I do have a bad habit of killing off my singing partners.
Noted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you tell us how did you end up in New York? I think you've been living in Manhattan since the 70s or so?
Yes, I moved. Well, as I said, we landed here in '67, and we had a lot of friends here because a lot of the American musicians who'd come to England had stayed with us. Danny Kalb of the Blues Project, Mark Silber, who ran the Fretted Instrument Shop in New York. Who else? And we hung out with all of them, you know, because we had the same managers and we were all doing concerts together. So when we came over here, we had a bunch of friends who met us at the airport and took us for a barbecue, which I'd never had in my life before. That was fun. And I looked around at New York City and said, yeah, I could live here. So 10 years later, I was offered a job over here. Oh, okay, fine. 2 suitcases, moved.
And you never look back?
True. I would go back every once in a while because my mother still lived there, but I've never wanted to go back to live in England, despite the healthcare over here.
You should have moved to Toronto.
Well, yes, except the first time we went to Toronto, which was in '67, I walked down, I think it was Yonge Street, and every shoe shop had shoes that my granny would have approved of. And that was another fun time. We were booked at the Mouse Hole, which was this little club, and the police had decided to shut down what was the sort of Greenwich Village equivalent in Toronto by blowing up a hepatitis scare. So we had no audience except Gordon Lightfoot, who came down every night to listen to us for the 4 nights we were there. So,
That would have been Yorkville, probably.
Yorkville, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. That's become one of the most sort of posh, expensive parts of Toronto now, which has changed a lot since the 1960s.
Haven't we all?
Yeah, very mood.
Not me.
So you've also been singing now as a solo act, and do you have a relationship with the South Street Sea Museum? Did I hear that correctly?
I'm part of the New York packet, except I rarely show up, which is a loose group of us who sing around here, and I used to show up when it was actually on the Wavertree, and we're going to be back on the Wavertree in June, so if the schedule permits, I will be down there. And I also, there's an extravaganza that happens currently on Zoom in New York called Exceedingly Good Song Night, and I usually manage to get to that, and I'm part of the Folk Music Society of New York, and we have various things going on, including our wonderful TradMad camp in end of August, beginning of September, which we're frantically planning for now. So, and I'm going to be singing at the Portsmouth Festival this year, apparently, end of September. And there are maritime festivals springing up all over. We regret the loss of the Mystic Festival. We think that they made a mistake in saying it wasn't worth doing. But we've got the Connecticut Sea Music Festival in Essex in June, so we've got great hopes that will take over and be the kind of festival that we've so much enjoyed, which wasn't just, concerts, but involved demonstrations and a symposium and lectures and hands-on stuff, which I think last time I was at Mystic, they had a mast, a sail, a rope, and you could pull the rope and the sail would go up the stick. Wow.
Right. Now, part of my journey with the sea shanties is, I guess you could say it's an extension of my interest in folk music in general. I was really drawn to Irish traditional music when I was pretty young. Yeah. And when I heard the shanties later on, and my dad was sort of playing me some of the recordings, the Young Tradition, A.L. Lloyd, Ewan McCall, I started developing this notion in my mind that these are English traditional songs, these are British traditional songs, or that kind of thing. And then the more I researched it, when I got shanties from the Seven Seas, Stan Hugill saying these are really Afro-Caribbean songs or African American songs from the Gulf port. And so the plot thickens, and I'm trying to find out more and more about this tradition, this lineage and whatnot. And then when we got to Mystic, for me that was another huge piece of the equation, which is the American merchant navy tradition, and seeing that all around us, in such a vibrant way. And can you tell us how you got connected to the Mystic Festival, and is that through the proximity to New York City, or how did that sort of come about?
The YT always sang shanties. We finished our first half, because in England you do 2 half-hour sets. The first half hour always ended with a group of shanties. And we did not, to be honest, have much knowledge or indeed interest in what they were used for. They were just damn good songs with choruses that you could persuade the audience to sing along on. So when I started going to the Mystic Festival and hanging out with people like Chris Calderway and Craig Edwards and Greg Kaufman, and started, oh, you're right, so that's when you go yank, yank, and that's when you go pump, and that was interesting. All right, I knew they were work songs, but I hadn't connected them with work, because mostly I hadn't done that work, although I've done some sailing, but mostly as a passenger. So it's just been interesting getting to know what was going on board, and so on and so forth. I'm still not 100% that I know what I'm singing about, but there are good songs, so.
So I'd like to tie tie that back to something you were mentioning earlier, this notion that people have that this is the folk song, this is the proper way it was done, and everything else is a deviation from this. And the more I've sort of researched, it seems like traditional music is antiquated popular music. It's what was the current pop music of the time, and you would have had those variations going on. And as you say, maybe someone got recorded at a certain point, and then that becomes sort of crystallized as the authentic way that it should be done. My question is, when you're talking about that show, Singing Together with William Appleby, was this something the young generation growing up in England after World War II, was there an attempt to sort of provide them with an English musical identity? Or do you think, again, it was people that just had these fun songs and they were kind of sharing them with young people and cleaning up the lyrics to make them appropriate for them? I
suspect that a lot of it was that these were songs that you didn't have to pay anybody's copyright for. Back in those days, the Musicians' Union in England was so powerful that the BBC was only allowed 8 hours of needle time, that is, playing gramophone records in a day. And every, for example, half-hour comedy show had to have 2 musical segments, which is why so many of England's comedians ended up as recording singers, because if somebody was going to have 2 minutes in their show, it was going to be them, right? So you get people like Ken Dodd and Max Bygraves singing and making records.
Barry Seacombe, I guess, is another one that comes to mind.
And that, for the rest of the time, the music was provided by the BBC Hack Singers Chorale, and if you'd ever heard them singing the Beatles, you'd just want to curl up and die. I'll sing Fire Marengo, which is, Royston wrote the tune for this, and the words were in Hugill. And the chorus goes, fire Marengo, fire away, not fire him away. I don't know where im came from, but im can go away as far as I'm concerned. Lift him up and carry him along.
Fire Marengo, fire away.
Put him down where he belongs.
Fire Marengo, fire away.
Screw the cotton, screw it down.
Fire Marengo, fire away.
Let's get the hell from Hilo Town.
Fire Marengo, fire away.
When I get back to Liverpool town.
Fire Marengo, fire away.
I'll throw a line to little Sally Brown.
Fire Marengo, fire away.
Sally, she's a pretty little craft.
Fire Marengo, fire away.
Cut sharp to the fore and drown dead aft.
Fire Marengo, fire away.
There's probably more, but the cotton is well screwed.
Now I find that interesting that those are lyrics that you guys found from Stan Hugill, but Royston wrote the melody to it. Because again, I think that is the authentic traditional approach, is to make up your own variation on it, and yet you might have people arguing that this is blasphemy and you guys should have never done that.
You know, Kipling said it best. There are 69 ways of constructing tribal lays, and every single one of them is right. That's it. You know, songs change. When you listen sometimes to a source singer who's been collected over a span of years, they've changed. They've changed their songs. All right, their voices have changed, so in some ways they're adapting to those changes. But the words may have changed, the tune may have changed somewhat. It's like pinning a butterfly to a corkboard. You know, what you have there is a dead butterfly. What you have in the world when you don't record it, but you carry on singing it, is a live song. And it will change. People will learn it, misremember it, remember it again, add bits to it. Why not?
You must have met Stan Hugill at some point in your life.
Oh yeah. And in fact, I just picked up a copy of a magazine that the Spinners of Liverpool put out, where Stan Hugel reviewed one of our albums.
No way.
That was fun. We met Stan, and he quite liked what we were doing. So.
I'm curious how much of what Stan wrote down was as he remembered it, and how much, maybe he didn't remember it and he sort of made certain things up. I don't know if you can speak to that at all.
I'm fairly certain that a lot of it was made up, just as I'm fairly certain that Bert Lloyd made a lot up. And there were things that the first collector who said, "I am not going to change anything," was Ritson, and that was back, way back when. Every other collector, people like Scott and Burns, who were collectors, changed things to suit themselves. And always remember that the singers who went around the country singing these songs were doing it for board and lodging and getting laid and things. And they would alter stuff to suit their audience, So for the poor people, it was always how the poor but honest milkmaid marries the prince in disguise. And for the richer families, it was how your noble family beat the crap out of somebody else. And there are, Chevy Chase and I think the Battle of Otterburn, two ballads, both traditional, different sides win in the two ballads. And it depends, whose victors write the history. That's the way it goes. But sometimes the non-victors can turn it around. I have the sheet music for the Battle of New Orleans that was released in England, which had the English winning. Pakenham said we could take them by surprise if we didn't fire our muskets. And it very clearly says, "Only for sale in the United Kingdom, Spain and Israel." Not for sale in the USA.
That reminds me of Santillana, where Santillana gains the day and he wins the battle there, which is not historically accurate, but makes for a good song and good story.
Well, if you look back at the propaganda that was going out in the Second World War, very, very different stories all the way. You always have to tell your people that you're doing just fine. So, even when you're not.
I just heard that recently. It was that the first casualty of war is the truth.
Yeah. And no battle plan survives contact with the enemy. That's the other one. That was Wellington, I believe. Although probably some ancient Greek said it first.
Or Mike Tyson's "Everyone's Got a Plan Until They Get Punched in the Face."
Exactly. This is the one song that anyone can sing because the chorus is just a grunt. In Liverpool I was born, bring 'em down. London is me home from home.
Bring 'em
and
down.
Liverpool girls I do admire, they
Bring 'em
set your
down.
rigging all afire.
Bring 'em
Yet
down.
round Cape Stiff we go,
Bring 'em
all
down.
through the ice and snow.
Bring 'em
Up the
down.
coast to Vallepo,
Bring 'em
northward
down.
to Callio.
Bring 'em
Them
down.
Vallepo girls I do adore,
Bring 'em
they
down.
takes it all and asks for more.
Bring 'em
Them
down.
Callio girls, they are so fine, they're
Bring 'em
never a day
down.
behind their time.
Bring 'em
Then it's back
down.
to Liverpool,
Bring 'em
spend me
down.
pay like a bloody fool.
Bring 'em down.
Liverpool born and bred,
Bring 'em
strong in the
down.
arm and thick in the head.
Bring 'em
Bring 'em
down.
down. I kept forgetting to sing the chorus, what the hell?
We got you covered.
Okay.
Can you tell us a bit about that version of the song before we part ways here?
Royston found it, God knows where, and I think he was the one who led it on the album, the EP. Remember EPs?
Well, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure, and
This has been fun, thank you.
and the young tradition has had such a big impact on us as well. So I want to thank you very much for that as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I particularly liked your story about the fir tree wanting to be turned into a mast and go sailing, one of the things I do is take fir and turn it into masts. So it seems nice to think that it's something that they actually want to do.
Yes. Well, if they knew about it, they would.
Yeah.
But they can't go back and say, "Hi guys, this is fun." How many ships sail in the forest? Quote. That's one of the My Bride is Marrying Somebody Else songs. The week before Easter, I think. How many strawberries grow on the salt sea and how many ships sail in the forest? Somewhere in folk music there's a quote for anything.
This ain't need, this ain't need, any need and all. Fire and fleet and candle lead, and Christ receive thy soul. If thou from here away dost pass, any need and all, to Winnie more thou comest at last, and Christ receive thy soul. If thou gavest ever holes in our shoe, any need and all, then sit ye down and put them on, and Christ receive thy soul. If thou from there away dost pass, any need and all, to purgatory's fire thou comest at last, and Christ receive thy soul. If thou gavest ever meat or drink, any need and all, the fire will never make thee shrink, and Christ receive thy soul. But if meat or drink thou ne'er gavest name, any need and all, the fire will burn thee to thy bare vein, and Christ receive thy soul.
Woof.
Wow.
It's only been 40 odd years since I sang that with the group. I love
Really?
it.
Thank you so much.
Thank
That's
you.
thank you. Like, you have no idea like how
Duh.
much I don't believe that just happened.
Yeah, that's
Oh,
pretty
that
incredible.
just happened.